Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. When I walked in, there was no rain, and so I think the weather's moving in the right direction, so that's all good. We talk about how in Colorado, if we have 3 days of cloudy weather, that we all start shaking and getting pretty uncomfortable, so I'm glad it's moving in the right direction. It's my pleasure. My name is Mary Ontiveros, and I am the Vice President for Diversity here at Colorado State University. And it's my pleasure to extend a hearty welcome to all of you on behalf of our office and on behalf of the university. And I welcome you to today's session, and I also welcome you to this year's Diversity Symposium. We are really at the tail end of the symposium. This is our last full day of events. We still have a speaker tomorrow, and I encourage you all to try to attend that. It's at 12:30, I believe. Where's Raya? 11:30. Thank you. In here, actually, and it is with Damon Williams, who is the individual who coined the term inclusive excellence, and we use that a lot, and I think he's going to be just fabulous as well. This symposium is hosted by the Office of the Vice President for Diversity, and it takes place every year at this time, and throughout the year, when we're not working on the symposium, we work on a whole variety of other activities, including institutes, educational programs, trainings, and what we're trying to do through our office is address policies, procedures, processes, and practices that negatively impact our ability to advance a quote-unquote diversity agenda, or put another way, we're trying to deter our campus from becoming one that fails to value inclusive excellence. We want to be a campus that truly can say that we welcome all individuals, we value them, and we affirm their contributions. And we do this through a number of not just activities, but some of the policies that we have addressed in the past include a policy on creating an inclusive physical and virtual campus that was adopted by the Cabinet in May. We're pretty proud of that. And it was through our office that the principles of community were created. That was a process that took about a year and a half, but involved about 2,000 people on this campus to come to agreement on statements that would define not what we do as a campus, but how we do it. Many of the issues that we talk about in our office and that we bring to you through our educational activities were discussed at this year's Diversity Symposium. So if many of you missed any of those, I encourage you to look into what will be happening next year and also into the kinds of programs that we continue to offer throughout the year. The symposium is coordinated by our Director of Diversity Education and Outreach, and she seems like a pretty modest person, but Raya, I am going to ask you to stand, and I know you're over there somewhere. Yay, Raya. And a lot of work goes into this program, as well as many of the others that she is in charge of. She works closely with individuals in our office, Alicia Sprague, who is there, and Tammy Liu, and I don't know if Tammy is here today. Tammy is on her way to Japan starting tomorrow. She will be there for 3 weeks, and so she's been working hard on this event and then is going to be leaving the country for a few weeks. And she works closely also with a committee, the Diversity Symposium Committee, and I would extend a welcome and an invitation to any of you who want to be a part of that committee. So if you are interested in that, please let us know. We are always looking for new ideas and people who have interest in moving forward this agenda. Last year, we began working with the School of Education, and we found through the last few years that by partnering and collaborating with other entities on campus that also do diversity work, that we can offer a greater breadth of sessions and depth of information and renowned speakers. And so last year we began working directly with the School of Education. We know that educators play a critical role in communicating values of inclusion, and their understanding of these issues is really very, very critical. And I'd like to call forward Kalpana Gupta, who is going to share with you a little bit about this partnership. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you all for attending the symposium this year. The School of Education is honored to be a part of it. The educational track has been created to specifically focus on pedagogical concerns regarding the topics of diversity, inclusion, and equity. This is the second year that we are offering the track and hope to continue this opportunity for years to come. This year we had 26 presentations that were targeted as part of the education track, and we had at least 28 graduate students, faculty, staff, and alumni present. We would like to thank our partners in making this possible. We couldn't do this without the support of the School of Education, the Center for Racial Justice Research and Advocacy, the Poudre School District, and especially the Office of Vice President for Diversity, and of course everyone that has participated in attending and presenting. In addition, we'd also like to acknowledge the support of the College of Health and Human Sciences and acknowledge our Dean, Jeff McCubbin, who is also here. So thank you, Dean McCubbin, for your support. And before I hand it over, I also want to let you know that if you're an educator or part of SOE, part of the School of Education, and you would like a certificate of participation for attending today's presentation, just find me at the end and we'll sign you up for our email and online survey that you will receive and then get the certificate of participation. So again, thank you. And without further ado, I'd like to just invite our School of Education co-director, Louise Jennings, up.
Welcome and thank you to Dr. Kalpana Gupta, and also they couldn't be here, but Drs. Juliana Searle and Wendy Fothergill worked with Kalpana a year ago after participating in the VP of Diversity Office Faculty Institute for Inclusive Excellence. Part of being part of that institute is to develop a project to incorporate diversity, equity, and inclusive excellence into our work. And that's how Kalpana, Wendy, and Juliana, as members of that institute, came up with the idea of integrating an education track into the Diversity Symposium and working with Raya and the VP of Diversity Office in doing that. So I really want to acknowledge and thank you for all of your work. And also to the committee that formed as a result of that. We have Melissa Pickett and Christian Romero Perry and Kalpana, am I forgetting anybody? Tobin Lopez, Dr. Tobin Lopez. So thank you to the committee. And because of this work, we were able to bring Dr. Christine Sleeter to campus as our keynote today. Dr. Sleeter identifies as an author, teacher, speaker, activist. These different roles and identities weave together, contributing to Dr. Sleeter's important influence in teacher education in general and social justice education in particular. Formerly a high school learning disabilities teacher in the Seattle Public Schools, she earned her PhD from the University of Wisconsin, then served as a faculty member at Ripon College and the University of Wisconsin-Parkside, before becoming a founding member of California State University, Monterey Bay, where she retired with emeritus honors in 2003. Dr. Sleeter is a leading and internationally recognized scholar in teacher education, anti-racist multicultural education, white teacher identity studies, and the ethnic studies movement. This leadership is reflected in her roles as past president of the National Association for Multicultural Education, past vice president of Division K, the Division of Teaching and Teacher Education of the American Educational Research Association, and a fellow of the American Educational Research Association. Her scholarship has been recognized through the American Educational Research Association Social Justice and Education Award, the Chapman University Paulo Freire Education Project Social Justice Award, and the American Educational Research Association Division K Legacy Award, among others. Dr. Sleeter has published 20 books and over 140 articles and book chapters, many of which are at the heart of teacher education classrooms. Her most recent nonfiction book is Unstandardizing Curriculum, Multicultural Teaching in the Standards-Based Classroom. As a teacher educator, I and many others have for 2 decades relied heavily on her work with Carl Grant, theorizing multicultural education practices through the book Making Choices for Multicultural Education, 5 Approaches to Race, Class, and Gender, now in its 6th edition. This work helps our students in the School of Education to frame multicultural practices from a critical perspective, then envision and put into practice their own plans for systematically advancing diversity, equity, and inclusion in their educational and professional settings. More recently, Dr. Sleeter has engaged in critical family history, which she explores through fiction in her novel White Bread, which is available in the lobby. You might have seen it coming in. Dr. Sleeter came into anti-racist multicultural education through ethnic studies, and today she draws on her expertise in this area to address a critical topic in today's national landscape: why ethnic studies and critical race theory matter in education. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Christine Sleeter.
Oh, it's quite a delight to be here with you this afternoon. And I would like to thank Louise for that wonderful introduction. Let me start by saying a little bit about how I got into ethnic studies, and especially me being a white person, why am I doing this in the first place? Because I think it helps shape my vision of ethnic studies and my vision of teaching, and also my vision of teacher growth. I grew up in Southern Oregon in a predominantly white community and really didn't have a whole lot of exposure to people of color in the US until I signed up for a teacher education program that was based in inner city Seattle. This is a picture of my first class in 1972, a 10th grade world history class. And when I arrived in Seattle and started getting to know my students, I realized that I knew almost nothing about where they were coming from. And right around that time, I started what became really a lifelong program of ethnic studies reading. These are covers of some of the books that I read at the beginning, but this is a program of reading that has actually never stopped. I still have stacks of stuff on my desk at home that I'm reading. And so the acquiring ethnic studies content knowledge across the range of ethnic studies is, I think, something that is central to doing the work of ethnic studies. As a classroom teacher, I remember being struck by the gap between the curriculum that I was supposed to teach and where my students were coming from and what they wanted to know. Just one very brief example is when I was student teaching and was assigned the topic Feudalism in Europe. Now, this is 10th grade world history. And started copying the way my cooperating teacher was teaching, and realized that my students were starting to fall asleep. And that was only like 5 minutes they were starting to fall asleep. My cooperating teacher left the room, and I just put the lecture notes down and asked the students what they wanted to learn. And after a lot of some discussion, they said they really wanted to learn something about the women's liberation movement. And I'm like, whoa, feudalism in Europe, women's liberation. How am I going to put those two together? Well, I didn't. I did a women's liberation movement kind of co-planned with the students and then had to get back to the curriculum. But what I learned from that is the second piece that's become central to how I think about ethnic studies teaching is that it involves collaboration with the students, co-construction with the students. It isn't simply sage on the stage giving knowledge to the students, but it's something that you do collaboratively with the students. And then a third piece that was really life-changing for me was living in the community where I was teaching, which at the time was a predominantly African-American community, and engagement with other people around me changed me and changed my view of the United States, what we're all about, and what could be happening in schools. Fast forward to today. There's been a lot of work at the K-12 level as well as the university level in trying to make the curriculum more diverse. So I'm going to kind of go back and forth between K-12 level and university level in my talk here, with probably a little bit more in K-12 because that's where my work has been most recently. But this is from some K-12 work. But it looks at the gap between the students and whose knowledge students are getting both in the textbook as well as from teachers. You can see the increased diversification of students who are in the public schools. The teacher demographics, both at the K-12 level as well as at the higher ed level, have not diversified nearly as rapidly as the students have been. And the content in textbooks, although it's more diverse than it was, say, 30 years ago, still really isn't. The two bottom rows are data from an analysis I and some graduate students did of social studies texts and reading language arts texts that were being used in New Mexico, but they were published by major publishing companies. And we went through counting the representation of diverse racial and ethnic groups in the texts. And you can see from the percentages that if you're a white kid, you are most likely to be taught by somebody who's from your white background. There's a lot of ways in which we differ, and the person may differ from you in many other ways. But somebody who's white and a textbook that for the most part will represent mostly people like you and perspectives like the ones you grew up with. If you're a student of color, that's not the case, both from a teacher point of view, who the teachers are, as well as whose knowledge is in the curriculum. And let me drill down a little bit as to what this looks like. If you were to try to figure out what the mainstream narrative is that schools teach, particularly in social studies, these are points that is pretty well ingrained in the curriculum. You can read these, I'll just read a couple of them. But the US was founded on Judeo-Western European ideals of justice and equality under the law. The U.S. capitalist economy provides opportunity for anyone to succeed through hard work. So like, why would you raise questions about it? Even though the U.S. was founded on slavery, its democracy has expanded to include more diverse peoples. Okay, now, within that framing, here's what happens when schools try to incorporate a little bit of knowledge about this sort of to diversify it. Let's take people of African descent. In history textbooks, these are the ways that people of African descent generally appear. A little bit about pre-colonial African civilizations, quite a bit about enslavement and slavery, some about the Harlem Renaissance, the civil rights movement, and then maybe a little bit about leaders today. If you're taking an African American history course, whether it's a university course or a secondary course, these would be more like what the ideas would be in the course. Now, this is a much richer, fuller look at African American people, African American history, also focusing in on some things that weren't in the earlier iteration of it, like colonization and enslavement and how those processes work, how racism has been institutionalized, how people of African descent resisted slavery and tried to build institutions within the African American community. So it's like this or this. Or looking at Mexican Americans. In curricula that are mainstream curricula, you may learn a little bit about the Mexican independence from Spain, U.S. annexation, the U.S.-Mexico War, some about industrialization, a little bit about work and immigration, the struggle for equal rights, and there would now pretty much always be something about Cesar Chavez, and a little bit about cultural contributions. Or you could get this, which would be a full-blown Mexican-American history class from a syllabus as it's being taught in UT Austin. So again, this or this. And the fragmented inclusion of people of color in the dominant curriculum leaves many students of color feeling like, as Caroline Turner put it, guests in someone else's house. And if you're a guest in someone else's house, as she writes, you feel like you can never relax and put your feet up on the table. Guests are not family whose foibles and mistakes are tolerated. And she goes on to talk about the pictures. Guests don't have their pictures up, their stuff around. It's always somebody else's. I am working on co-editing a book called Rethinking Ethnic Studies that I'll talk about a little bit later. But one of the chapters in there by Agustin Romero and Julio Camarota, and I'll talk a little bit about their chapter later. But they've framed what they're doing as we schools and they schools. And for students of color, both at K-12 and in higher ed, it's a lot of times going to they schools, not we schools. So what ethnic studies does is it acts as a counter to these kinds of patterns. Now, many of you who know my work know me more from multicultural education. And so sometimes people will ask me, what are you doing in ethnic studies? Or multicultural education? So to look at briefly at these three definitions and see if you can pick out which ones are definitions of ethnic studies and which are definitions of multicultural education. Okay, I'm not going to give you a whole lot of time here, but these are... Anybody get them all? The point I want to make is that there's a whole lot of overlap, especially now, I think, between ethnic studies and critical multicultural education. Ethnic studies is developed more at the higher ed level, multicultural education more at the K-12 level, both of them coming out of the activism of the civil rights movement. And although one can go through and pick out some differences between them, I think right now the similarities and the synergy between them are more important than the differences. There's a vibrant movement for ethnic studies particularly in secondary schools right now. And a lot of, I think, misconceptions or not very well-informed conceptions about what ethnic studies is, what an ethnic studies curriculum might look like. This is an example of something that's floating around California, and it does what I call the group of the month approach, in which you study different groups as almost like in silos, as if they were hermetically sealed. And it's like, this isn't bad information, but it's missing an opportunity to do some things that I'll be elaborating on here. Like one of the things that to me jumps out is by not looking across groups, we're missing a chance to do a deep analysis of how racism works and how it may be refracted differently in different groups' experience, but how racism was constructed and works in this country, and what kinds of things people have been doing to challenge racism. And you don't get that real well with the group of the month approach. Ethnic studies grew out of, as I mentioned, the civil rights movement, and particularly through protests in the 1960s, protesting against the irrelevance of the university curriculum to communities of color. There are a number of definitions of ethnic studies, but these are three that I like that were written at different points of time from people representing different racial ethnic groups. But what they get at is ethnic studies as providing the intellectual foundation for challenging relations of power. That's embedded in all three of these, for challenging colonization, challenging racism, and trying to rewrite the narrative. I was asked to talk about ethnic studies in relationship to critical race theory, which was kind of interesting because I'd given talks on critical race theory and I'd given talks on ethnic studies, and I never gave them in the same talk. But what I've realized is that ethnic studies that is grounded in critical race theory or guided by critical race theory, I think will take you in the right direction. But critical race theory has not dealt near as much with curriculum and pedagogy as ethnic studies has. Critical race theory, which grew out of critical legal studies, makes the assumption that racism is endemic, institutional, and systemic. It's not an aberration, but rather a fundamental way of organizing society. And if you take this assumption as a grounding assumption to start with, then critical race theory offers a number of useful conceptual tools for analyzing how racism works and analyzing challenges to racism. That it questions colorblindness and meritocracy. It names whites as beneficiaries of racial remedies, working with the concept of interest conversions. It values the experiential knowledge and the counter stories by people of color about racism who live it every day in ways that are different from white people, but white people who end up being the ones that create most of the texts that make it into schools. And then commitment to work for social justice. There's been a little bit of work by critical race theorists about what curriculum and pedagogy might look like. I think the main person who's thought about it in relationship to curriculum is Terry Yasso. Now I'm going to hit you here with some conceptual frameworks, but then I'm going to pull this together into 4 implications for what this means for teaching. So please go ahead and take pictures of the slides, and if you're feeling like overwhelmed by too many conceptual frameworks, don't worry, because we'll get to something a little bit more concrete in a minute. But I want to sort of lay a little bit of foundation here. What Tara writes about when she talks about a critical race curriculum is a curriculum in which knowledge of people of color is central rather than at the periphery, like the examples I gave earlier. The curriculum is structured around experiences of people of color with a focus on racism. And examining racism becomes one of the things at the heart of the curriculum. But racism also in relationship to multiple other forms of difference and oppression. And there's collaboration with organizations in the community that are working on challenging racism and reclaiming historical memory. You'll see these themes circulate a bit in other, where I go. There's been a little bit of work around what a critical race pedagogy would look like. And I think this is a really good example where Van Locke, in a recent article, described how she used critical race pedagogy in her own class, where she talks about a foundation being involving trusting relationships among teachers and students. Practices that incorporate student voice and student experience into the classroom, which kind of takes me back to my story of when I was learning to teach. Intentionality in the critical texts and activities that students will engage in to shape their analysis of social issues. And again, a rejection of the idea of neutrality, that everybody needs to own where they come from, including the professor. The ethnic studies literature kind of parallels these themes, but I think in more depth. So I'm going to flip over to the ethnic studies literature, but I think the main takeaway that I'd like to leave you with is that ethnic studies with critical race sensibilities make sense. Ethnic studies without critical race sensibilities may well leave you back at the group of the month approach to dealing with race and ethnicity. Ethnic studies curriculum. I am working with and collaborating with 3 colleagues in co-editing a book that will be called Rethinking Ethnic Studies. It will come out of Rethinking Schools, which you may be familiar with if you're working in K-12. And when we were thinking about a framework for organizing it, my collaborators are Tolteca Cuatin, who's an ethnic studies teacher in Southern California, Miguel Zavala, who's a professor at Chapman University, and Wayne Au, who's a professor at University of Washington, Bothell, who's also on the Rethinking Schools board. And Tolteca, one of my collaborators, had taken some work I had earlier done, synthesizing the main themes that run through the ethnic studies literature. Because I mentioned I started reading the ethnic studies literature and didn't stop. And somewhere along the way, I had a sabbatical, this was a while back, and decided to go through and figure out what were the main core ideas that run through the ethnic studies literature. So Tolteca picked up on that and engaged in conversations with other people involved in ethnic studies in California and developed this framework, which we're using for the book. And the idea is that ethnic studies deals with what we're calling a double helix of humanity and criticality. By humanity, we mean working towards restoring the humanity among students and communities of color who have been dehumanized in the process of living with racism and colonization every day, including in the schools, and providing a space in the schools that reclaims that humanity that gets lost when kids are put down all the time. Criticality is developing a mindset for thinking critically about the world and your place in that world, and particularly looking at how actions and people and stuff are embedded in unequal relations of power, and asking what can be done to change those relations. We have 4 core ideas that we're arguing should be part of an ethnic studies curriculum, not necessarily part of like every class session, not even necessarily part of every course, but a part of every program. Indigeneity and roots is the idea of both honoring and paying attention to the indigenous peoples of the place where we are, as well as attending to the indigenous roots that all of us have someplace, and then how our indigeneity shapes who we are. Colonization and dehumanization looks at the process of colonization as it was constructed in the process of building capitalism and in the process of constructing slavery, and historically how capitalism, slavery, and colonization worked together, but did so through dehumanizing peoples of color around the world and on the North American continent. Hegemony looks at the question of how beliefs and knowledge is shaped, and how it is that people come to believe stories that legitimize unequal relations, and the counter stories that arise from communities of color and other oppressed peoples that challenge the dominant narratives. And then we're going to also try to come up with less clumsy terminology. That's one of the discussions we're having on email right now. Regeneration, rehumanization, transformation, social justice deals with the process of healing, the healing from the trauma of oppression, and learning to work for social justice and to make social change. How you do this in the classroom gets to the question of ethnic studies pedagogy. Some colleagues and I in the California chapter of the National Association for Multicultural Education asked the question to a good friend of mine, Alison Tintiago Cabales, in the ethnic studies program at San Francisco State. She was working with San Francisco Public Schools on developing ethnic studies. And I just called her up and said, Alison, how can California name help? Or, do you need our help? And she said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, because a lot of people are teaching ethnic studies who don't have a clue about how to teach ethnic studies. So we collaborated on pulling together, based on reviews of research and stuff, a portrait of what ethnic studies pedagogy is. And enough of that will come out of where I'm going that I'm not going to read all the points here, because you'll see it in how I want to pull all of this together. I was thinking as I was coming here, okay, now I'm talking about ethnic studies and critical race theory and critical multicultural education, and what would be implications for people who are trying to figure this stuff out as to what it might look like as we go forward. So I want to offer 4, and I'll give you an example for each one. First, students are treated as intellectuals and as critical questioners, as knowledge creators. And this is particularly important for students from historically marginalized communities whose schools rarely treat as intellectuals, rarely treat as knowledge creators. I come from the California state system and saw something that just blew my mind once, where the University of California system, which is like the upper track, was the knowledge creation track, and the Cal State system, which is the working class and students of color, was the knowledge consumption track. That was almost the terms that they were using. And I'm like, wow. So here's an example of a 4th grade teacher who teaches in a very low-income school in El Paso. It's a very large elementary school. I think there's something like 13 teachers for every grade level. Huge school. In a very poor community, mostly Mexican and Mexican immigrant, Mexican-American students. And I'm just going to play a little bit of a clip of her about how she frames teaching.
One thing we talk about a lot is that we're all learners, and we all learn differently, and we're always learning, and that knowledge is just not contained in the classroom. On the contrary, knowledge is all around. It's outside, it's in our families, it's in our culture. So I start thinking about, well, we all have the right to know, and we can also produce knowledge, not just consume it. So we write posters about that and how we question, like, well, what is knowledge, or who gets to say what knowledge is, and then why it's so important to make sure we have different perspectives, because we need those to have accurate information and to be making reasonable decisions and reasonable thinking. We also talk about thinkers and questioners. And so a thinker in the class is someone who questions, who can question the teacher, who can question their schooling, who can question things respectfully. And we talk about what that looks like. So it's not the questioning where you say, Mom, well, why do I have to clean my room? Not that type of questioning. But it's the questioning that involves, like, well, why am I doing this handout? Or why am I engaged in this learning process? So we actually, I guess, sit in a circle and act it out as to how you would question and what you would question. And the students question me all the time. So I think having that, I guess, almost authority, that autonomous learners, they start really engaging in that, and they engage each other, and they push each other, and they push me as well. So thinkers and questioners, and we talk a lot about college on a daily basis. And first of all, the necessity for why we go to college and learning, and you can go to any college in the world. I print a lot of the different, a list of different colleges, and then they do research of the different programs that are on there. Especially, I think, in a community that is labeled low socioeconomic, and college is rarely talked about sometimes in these communities. So I really make it a point to talk about college and talk about the different degrees and about the different things you can learn in any part of the world.
And her students had consistently, I only sort of take tests with a grain of salt, but had scored the highest on the tests of any of the other 4th grade students. Because she was treating them as intellectuals and not just slogging them through the text. A second idea is that the curriculum centers knowledge of and by people of color, including unpacking how racism works. And an example I would like to offer of this is going to be hard to read, but it's the San Francisco Unified 9th grade Ethnic Studies curriculum. And you can find this online. They haven't put very much of what they're doing online yet. But you can find it by Googling San Francisco Unified School District Ethnic Studies, and you'll be able to find it. But they have a year-long ethnic studies course that they've divided into 6 units. But San Francisco being very diverse, it's not focused on one group, but they also are not doing the group of the month approach, but instead are connecting diverse racial and ethnic groups, as well as gender and women's issues, as well as social class, as well as there's some disability rights in here. But let me read you the main concepts of their units. The first unit is on identity and narrative, around the question of whose narratives have we been listening to? Where do narratives come from, and how did that shape who we think we are? Systems and power, where students then learn how power is organized into systems, economic systems, political systems, and refracted through race and through class and through gender. Hegemony and counter-hegemony, which earlier when I was talking about ways in which we think, what the stories are, where they come from, and what the counter-stories are that emerge from oppressed communities. Humanization and dehumanization. What processes have students gone through that have been dehumanizing processes? How are people dehumanized, and how can we rehumanize people who have been put in positions of being dehumanized? Causality and agency, which gets at what you can do and how you can actually make a difference. Things are caused by something else, and it may be you. And then transformation and change, which then looks at how can we engage collectively in transformation for social justice. And these are readings that they suggest on their website. They use actually a whole lot of readings in their courses. But I've had the privilege of being able to look in quite a bit of depth in their curriculum. And I hope that they do start putting more of it online, because it's one of the best both ethnic studies as well as critical multicultural studies curricula that I've seen anywhere. The next example from elementary I'm going to skip. So a third implication is that pedagogy rests on close relationships with students and recognition of the knowledge that they bring. And as an example to illustrate this, I'm going to look at the Raza Studies model that was developed by Agustin Romero, Julio Camarota, and other colleagues in the Mexican-American Studies program in Tucson, where they were trying to increase the achievement of Latino students by connecting an ethnic identity with an academic identity. And they have practices around what their curriculum is, what their pedagogy is, and what the relationships are. And when I first learned about the program, I thought they started their planning with curriculum. It turns out I was wrong. In the book I'm co-editing, they have a chapter, and they start the chapter off after they talk about we schools and they schools by when they first started inventing this social justice education project. They went into a high school classroom and decided to treat the students as intellectuals, gave them some readings from Paulo Freire, and told the students to read Paulo Freire, not the whole book. These are ninth graders, many of them on the verge of dropping out of school, and then come in, sit in a circle, and talk about the implications for the students' lives. Well, the students, they came in, sat in a circle, and just looked at each other. They didn't want to participate. And Julio and Augie were, pulling, trying to, asking questions, trying to get them, and finally said, "What is it with you guys? Why won't you participate?" And they said, "We don't trust you. We don't know you. You don't know us. We don't know what your agenda is. People come in here with agendas. We're not going to open up about our lives to people who we don't even trust." So that led them to start with relationships and building relationships with the kids, with their families, with their communities, telling their own stories and having the kids tell their stories. Because without those relationships, all the rest of the ethnic studies teaching couldn't have happened the way it did. And then their pedagogy engages students in analysis of problems in their communities using social science research methods to collect data and examine problems and propose solutions, and then using a curriculum that is aligned with the state standards, honors aligned, and run through Chicano intellectual frameworks. But I thought it was really interesting that they couldn't have gone anywhere if they weren't focusing first on relationships. And then the last point is that students learn to examine and address real problems in their communities. And for this example, I'll turn to another high school classroom because he does this so well. This is Paulo Macalas, who's a teacher in Anaheim, California, and has been teaching ethnic studies now for several years. And he has his students for a year, and they come in and talk about what some of the problems are in their communities. Human trafficking being one, the school-to-prison pipeline, Airbnbs, which I didn't realize was a problem in the communities, but it is. Charter schools is a problem in the communities. And then in the class, they analyze the roots of these problems, the global manifestations of the problems. They learn to do research on the problems. They go out into the community, collect data that helps them understand the problems and generate solutions. And then they learn to do presentations. They write academic papers, do formal presentations at conferences. I've seen them. It's amazing. As well as to the city council, to the school, that they become social change advocates. At the university level, if we're teaching ethnic studies at the university level, our students generally don't come from one community. They come from a bunch of communities. And at my university, we work with that through service learning projects. We have a huge service learning program that involves all of the majors and is connected in with projects all over the communities where I live. This one example, a Chinatown Renewal Project, humanities class has been involved in gathering oral histories in an area of Salinas that used to be Chinatown, and is putting together an archive and possibly a museum. All of this makes a difference. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about the research on the impact of ethnic studies, but I have reviewed it. And you can get this report that I did in 2011 if you just Google Sleeter ethnic studies. It's about the first thing that comes up. I was asked by the National Education Association to review the research on ethnic studies, both K-12 as well as higher education. So I did, and I found all the studies I could find that reported data, and divided them into two piles. One pile looked at the impact of ethnic studies on students of color. And I ended up looking at projects in about 16 different projects in which data were reported. And of those, 15 of the 16 reported positive impacts on students in terms of academic achievement, personal empowerment, engagement in school. Just one example from the Mexican American Studies program in Tucson, Nolan Cabrera and his colleagues reported on a very complex statistical study looking at the impact on that program. But the summary, the estimated relationship between participation in Mexican American studies and student educational attainment was surprisingly strong. The students had significantly higher passing scores on the state tests and graduation rates than did their non-Mexican American studies peers. And this was in spite of the fact that the students came into the courses lower in achievement, but they left higher in achievement. They sort of flipped the achievement gap. Same thing with a recent study that was done on the San Francisco ethnic studies class, where the researchers found that participation in the ethnic studies class, and I showed you the kind of curriculum schema for it, led to a large and statistically significant improvements in students' 9th grade GPA, attendance, and credits earned. The other pile that I divided the studies into were those that reported the impact on diverse student populations that included white students. And most of this research was done at the higher ed level. There was some at the K-12, but most of it was at the higher ed level. And basically what it found is that taking an ethnic studies course or a women's studies course had generally a positive impact on students' cross-group attitudes, mostly because for a lot of students it was the first time they had been exposed to a systemic analysis of discrimination, because they hadn't at the K-12 level, and it provided a window for understanding the world that a lot of the students just didn't have. If there was cross-group interaction in the class, that deepened the potency of the class in changing the students. And while the first ethnic studies class can be challenging, especially for white students, if students stick with it, then they grow a lot. Some people, let's see, I think I'm going to skip this and go on to what about teacher education? Because I know that a lot of you are in education. And this is something that institutions in California right now are trying to grapple with. I know we're not the only place grappling with it, but it's what I know best. And maybe one of the most interesting projects right now is taking place at Sacramento State University. This is from an article where the URL is at the bottom. You can Google it and get the article. But the authors here, Dale Allender and Margarita Berta Avila, talk about the collaboration that they have between the Ethnic Studies Department on campus, the Teacher Education Department, and then a grassroots organization called Ethnic Studies Now Sacramento. In California, we have a kind of a statewide grassroots from the communities, Ethnic Studies Now. And Sacramento developed a fairly organized chapter of Ethnic Studies Now. In fact, I didn't know it had chapters until people in Sacramento told me they were a chapter. But through this collaboration, the Ethnic Studies faculty are writing the curriculum for social studies certification. The teacher education faculty are writing and will be teaching the curriculum for teachers who will be teaching the ethnic studies, social studies that they get from the ethnic studies faculty. And then they're collaborating with schools and with the communities through Ethnic Studies Now, so that this isn't just a higher ed venture, but it's something that connects across the communities and is relevant to the communities in which they are. So I think by way of concluding, critical race theory itself has done relatively little work in curriculum and pedagogy. But critical race theory is an incredibly useful compass for thinking about ethnic studies, because ethnic studies can go off into other directions. The other day I got sent something asking if I would write something related to a book on images of Polish people in film. And I'm like, well, that's interesting, but that's kind of a different way of thinking about ethnic studies than what I've been describing here and the work that I'm doing. Ethnic studies that centers race and racism, that treats students of color and students from other marginalized communities as intellectuals, that connects with and engages with communities that students come from and becomes relevant to addressing community needs and community problems, and that includes dialogue across differences and helps us learn to talk and collaborate across our differences. That's the kind of ethnic studies that the research shows makes a powerful impact on students, both students of color as well as white students. So, thank you. And I think there's time for a few questions.
We have Christian and Ben are going to help us with microphones so we can hear your questions.
Don't be shy now. If you have a question, you can raise your hand.
Yeah, down here.
Can we talk about what happened in Tucson a little bit? And I feel that it's going to continue to happen. So I'm wondering, how do we combat this notion that ethnic studies is sort of like this left-wing ideology or anti-American?
That's really interesting when I hear ethnic studies as anti-American, because ethnic studies grew up in America. It's kind of like jazz. Here's where it came from. And the other countries really don't exactly have ethnic studies like the US has ethnic studies. But one of the ways that I've worked to combat that idea is by pulling together, and in a way this sounds kind of wonky, but it's something that there are people who will pay attention to it. Pulling together the research that shows what the impact of ethnic studies is on students. Because I know at the K-12 level, when people are trying to figure out how do we improve student achievement, And the majority now of students who are in the K-12 schools are students of color. And I don't think you can ask that question without taking into account of who the students are. And where ethnic studies does have now a track record of, even on the most mundane ways of measuring student achievement, like how well did you score on math tests and what was your GPA and stuff like that, it makes a positive difference. And that's been helpful in persuading some people. The other thing, though, is that a lot of people who criticize ethnic studies don't know really anything about it because they haven't ever been in an ethnic studies class, and they have assumptions about what they think it is and isn't. I know in Tucson, which I was so glad to see, that the judge ruled that the law declaring ethnic studies in Arizona, the law itself was racially motivated and declared the law unconstitutional. I thought that was so grand. But some of the white folks had believed that the program was, I mean, they hadn't even visited the classes. They saw a reference to Karl Marx in a footnote in Paulo Freire's book, and that was one of the things that set them off. So what I try to do with people is help them to understand what ethnic studies actually is. The part about addressing becoming social change agents is, in this country, we have huge problems involving race and racism. I mean, right now, we have a president who can't even figure out how to get resources to Puerto Rico. I mean, you know, like, come on. And what ethnic studies does is it helps give everybody who's in the class, and it can have people who look like me as well as people who don't look like me, the tools to learn how to address social problems, with the goal of trying to make this country a country that works better for everybody. And that may feel disruptive, but if we don't figure out ways of enabling young people to become activists on behalf of their communities to address the problems that a whole lot of us can see, then I really worry about what's going to happen to this country. So when I'm talking with audiences about ethnic studies and why we need ethnic studies and how ethnic studies isn't anti-American, but actually is very American, those are some of the main arguments that I use. But I do encourage you to become familiar with what the research says about the impact of ethnic studies, because I've on a number of occasions spoken with groups where they're kind of like, oh. And then you start pointing, you know, some of the charts showing research and kind of, huh? Oh. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they like it, but it gives a different point of view.
We'll get you next. We'll get you next.
So I guess, do you feel like that it makes more sense to, you know, if you have a school where a K-12 school that is majority one ethnicity, do you feel like it makes more sense to, you know, have a specific ethnic studies class that is very focused on like that ethnicity and what problems they have, or a more diverse look at how at that ethnicity, and not just that ethnicity, but at a lot of other ethnicities, and how, like, what do you feel like is the most effective way at solving those issues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Let me go back here to one of the earlier slides that I think will help frame the question. Okay, so say I'm in a school in which the majority of the students are Latino. And when you look at here, where you look at this chart, and you look under Latino, where the kids have been going through school, where they probably haven't had teachers from their own background, or maybe one. pretty much absent in the textbooks. You got to start where people are and with who they are. Because if I were to have my ethnic studies program start to teach them about somebody else, their school program has been teaching about somebody else. And eventually, we all need to understand and be able to dialogue across our differences. But we do it by starting with being grounded in who we are. So I think that, and I think this is why the program in Tucson had such a powerful effect on kids, because it was really trying to help decolonize their minds from having gone through a school system that had been framing them as kind of like nothing. There was quite a bit of work that went into the program to help the students see themselves as intellectuals with a rich background of knowledge, with communities and homes with rich backgrounds of knowledge, with a lot of history, and who could actually do something to address issues in their community and to make this country a better place. But then having said that, you don't stop there. Because the students do need to learn across ethnic group. You can't have silos, but you need to start kind of where the students are. Does that make sense? Yeah.
We've got one more up here for you. Upper right.
Mine's kind of a similar question. I'm wondering how we can contextualize ethnic studies within like an almost invariably white student body.
Say that again.
How can we contextualize? We talked about how context about the community is really important. When the community is almost completely white, is there a good way to contextualize to build bridges between those different cultures?
Yeah, what I've been doing as part of my work recently is developing something I call critical family history. And my book out there, actually White Bread, is an example of that. And with that, I start by having people research their own family history, their own background, but doing so within a lens that looks at how your people were positioned within relations of power based around race, around class, around gender, in the time and place in which they were. And it's I've taught this with one university class, which turned out to be really, really interesting. Because for white people, actually for most of us when we try to do family history, but particularly for white people, and there is research that bears this out, we tend to focus just on our own individual family story, and we don't look at the wider context. And so by getting white students to look at the wider context, you might ask a question of, okay, so if your ancestors homesteaded, on whose land were they homesteading? What was the relationship between the white people and the indigenous peoples of that land? It doesn't necessarily make your ancestors necessarily bad people, but it does position you in relationship to the US government's theft of Indian land. And so then I'm sort of starting from a white point of view, but also getting into looking at issues that relate to race, ethnicity, and class, just starting from a different standpoint. And I found that for myself, the critical family history is a real interesting entree for helping white students both learn just I've learned from my own family history like a whole lot about US history that I never learned when I was going through school. But I've also, by framing it, looking at my family in relationship to relations of class, relationships of colonization, of economic development, of immigration, it's opened up some avenues. Just another example, just from my own family history, I discovered one of my great-grandmother, I can't remember how many greats, turned out to be an anti-Chinese activist in San Francisco. And it was like, whoa, what does that mean and where did that come from? Which got me to looking into relationships between white people and the Chinese community in San Francisco right around the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And then asking the question of how could an immigrant from Switzerland end up as an anti-Chinese activist, which then took me into looking at the time that she spent in Vicksburg, Mississippi, right before and during the Civil War, in the context of slavery and racism. But that's like starting from my white story, just not keeping my white story in a silo.
Yeah, up here.
Thank you for coming. Can you talk a little bit about the tensions that I see between the traditional academic disciplines in universities, history, sociology, political science, and ethnic studies? Is it a challenge of change, or how is that relationship working out?
Well, I think any discipline can be taught through an ethnic studies perspective. And just to give you an example, in the 1980s, when I was a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin Parkside, I and somebody that we had hired to run what at the time was called Minority Student Affairs, an African-American linguist, decided to start an ethnic studies program at the university. And it still exists, actually. They now have an ethnic studies minor. And then he left, and so I chaired the program for a year or so. And I didn't want to keep chairing. One, I don't like doing administration work, but two, I'm in teacher education. I want to get back to teacher education. So the person who stepped up, who was really interested in becoming involved in ethnic studies and was a senior faculty member, was from biology. And he was from India and was very interested about different worldviews shaping health, how we understand biology, how we understand our bodies, how we understand science. And I was like, wow, okay, science from an ethnic studies perspective, that's really cool. But it takes somebody looking at their discipline through an ethnic studies lens to figure out what to do about it. I've done workshops in several universities about kind of infusing ethnic studies into the curriculum or infusing critical multiculturalism into the curriculum. And one of the things that I have people do is a search for syllabi in their discipline, cross-listed with, you know, say if I'm teaching, say, hospitality management, cross-listed with African Americans, with Latinos, with Mexican Americans, with just see what bubbles up. And courses sometimes do bubble up that are ethnic studies courses in disciplines where you wouldn't necessarily think to find ethnic studies. So it's doable, but it takes work on the part of people both in the department, to figure out how to make it work. But what I learned from Professor Datta is if you can make biology and ethnic studies go together, you can make everything go together.
Continue to have a conversation with Dr. Christine Sleeter and with each other, continue to dialogue about these because we are the School of Education. I see Dr. Jean Gleckner here, the other co-director of the School of Education. We are hosting a reception right out here in the lobby. So we have some nice food and opportunity for you to continue the conversation. And thank you again, Christine. So make sure we let Dr. Sleeter get out into the lobby too.
Hanging that for you. Yeah, thanks, Louise.